The first star system went dark on a Tuesday. Not dark the way systems went dark when a star died, slowly and with warning, the kind of death that gave civilization centuries to prepare. Dark the way a candle went dark when someone cupped their hand around it and squeezed. One moment the Varathi system was broadcasting on 47 communication frequencies, trade signals and navigation beacons, and the ordinary noise of 400 million people living their lives. The next moment it was silent, every frequency, all at once. Like someone had reached across the light years and turned off a switch. The Keth Imperial Monitoring Station recorded the silence at 3:40 Standard Time and flagged it as a communication array malfunction. This was the most reasonable explanation. Communication arrays malfunctioned. It happened. The monitoring station logged the event, assigned it a priority classification of routine, and placed it in the queue for standard follow-up investigation. The follow-up investigation was scheduled for 11 days later. The Varathi system did not reappear on any frequency in those 11 days, or the 11 days after that. It was gone, completely and permanently gone, in the way that things were gone when something had happened to them rather than something had malfunctioned around them. And the difference between those two categories was the difference between a problem and a catastrophe. The Keth Empire discovered this when the follow-up investigation vessel arrived at the Varathi system's coordinates and found nothing where 400 million people had been. Not ruins, not wreckage, not the debris field of a destroyed civilization or the scorched remnants of a bombed world. Nothing. The planets were there. The star was there. The orbital infrastructure, the stations and refineries and transit platforms that 400 million people had built over 3 centuries of habitation, was gone, but the planets themselves remained, unchanged, exactly as the last survey had recorded them. The people were gone. Every single one. The investigation vessel's commander, a career officer named Breck San, who had spent 23 years in the Keth Imperial Survey Corps, and who had a professional obligation to describe things accurately rather than emotionally, sent his preliminary report back to Imperial Central with a single line of summary that his superiors would later quote in every briefing about what came after. He wrote, 400 million people have been removed from this system, and I cannot determine by what means or to what destination, and I recommend immediate escalation to the highest available authority, because I do not believe this is something the Survey Corps has the frameworks to address. Imperial Central escalated. What they found, when they pulled every archive and every intelligence file, and every fragmentary record that touched on the question of what could remove 400 million people from a planetary system without leaving debris, without leaving wreckage, without leaving any physical evidence of the mechanism of removal, was a name. The name appeared in the oldest files, the ones filed under categories that modern imperial intelligence bureaucracy labeled as low-confidence historical assessment, which was the professional way of saying stories that might be true but that nobody had confirmed, and that it was professionally uncomfortable to take seriously. The name was Humanity. The files on humanity were thin in the way that files were thin when the subject had been deliberately underestimated for a long time. There were fragments, trade records from 300 years ago mentioning vessels of human origin that had declined to register with imperial authorities and had operated in the outer territories without authorization and had, when imperial enforcement vessels had attempted to intercept them, simply not been there when the enforcement vessels arrived. Intelligence assessments from 150 years ago noting increased human activity in several border regions and recommending monitoring without action. Diplomatic overtures sent to coordinates believed to be associated with human territory, none of which had ever received a response. And then, buried in a file so old that the encoding format required a specialist to render it, a single report from a field intelligence officer named Vas Tan, dated 230 years ago, marked urgent and escalated, and apparently never acted upon. The report said, "I have made contact with a human representative in the outer corridor. I was not seeking this contact. The representative found me. The representative told me one thing and then left before I could respond. The thing they said was this: the Keth Empire is approaching a line. We have not defined the line publicly because we do not believe in public ultimatums. We define it privately to the specific people who need to understand it at the specific moment when it becomes relevant. You are the relevant person at this relevant moment. The line is the same line it has always been. Leave the border settlements alone, all of them, every one, permanently. This is the only time this will be said." The report continued, "I do not know what the line's consequences are because the representative left before I could ask. I am sending this report because I believe it is important, and because I am uncertain whether the relevant authorities are aware that this communication occurred. I am requesting guidance on how to respond." The guidance file was empty. Nobody had responded to Vastan's report. Nobody had acted on it. And 230 years later, the Keth Empire had spent 3 decades conducting what its internal policy documents called border consolidation operations in the outer territories, which was the administrative language for a campaign of systematic expansion that had absorbed 64 inhabited settlements in the regions adjacent to the space that the fragmentary intelligence files associated with human territory. 64 settlements, 11 million people belonging to 14 different minor species, relocated or absorbed or in some cases simply not mentioned in the post-consolidation census, reports in ways that the Empire's auditors had noted as irregular, and that the Empire's senior administration had declined to investigate. The Varathi system had been the 65th. Except the Varathi system was not a border settlement. It was a core imperial world, 400 million imperial citizens, one of the most economically significant systems inside the Empire's established territory. Whatever line the human representative had described to Vastan 230 years ago, the Keth Empire had apparently crossed it 65 times without consequence, and had concluded, on the basis of those 65 crossings, that the consequence was nothing. The conclusion was wrong. Supreme Director Hall Voss ran the Keth Empire's Security Directorate from a heavily fortified installation on the imperial capital world, and she had been running it for 19 years, and she had developed over those 19 years an instinct for the difference between a problem that was serious and a problem that was existential. And the moment the Varathi system report crossed her desk, she felt, in the specific way she felt things that mattered, that this was the second kind. She pulled the old intelligence files herself. Read every fragment. Read Vastan's report 3 times. Looked at the timeline of border consolidation operations laid against the timeline of the fragmentary human contact records. Then she went to see Emperor Drethais personally, which she had done exactly 4 times in 19 years, each time because the situation required the Emperor's direct attention, and his intermediate staff could not be trusted to convey the full weight of it. The Emperor was in his private strategy chamber when she arrived, reviewing projections for the next phase of border consolidation, which was scheduled to absorb 12 additional settlements over the following 2 years. He looked up at her with the expression of a man who was used to receiving serious news from her, and who trusted her assessment of what was serious. "Varathi," he said. "Varathi," she confirmed, "and something else." She laid out everything: the silence, the empty system, the investigation vessel's report, the old intelligence files, Vastan's report from 230 years ago, the 64 border settlements, the line. The Emperor listened without interrupting, which was what he did when he understood that interrupting would be costly. When she finished, he looked at the strategic projection he had been reviewing, at the map of 12 additional settlements marked for absorption in the next 2 years, and he was quiet for a long moment. "One system," he said finally. "One system to send a message." "Sir," Hall said carefully, "I don't believe it's a message." "Then what is it?" "I believe it's a demonstration," she said, "of method, not of intent. Intent was communicated 230 years ago, and we declined to receive it." She paused. "I believe the Varathi system is not a warning. I believe it is the first result of a process that has already been decided." The Emperor looked at her. "You think there will be more?" "I think," Hall said, "that the Varathi system was the 65th crossing of a line that was described to us clearly and that we chose not to act on. I think the response to 65 crossings is not one system. I think one system is the opening, not the message." The Emperor was quiet again. "Find them," he said. "Find out where they are. Find out what they want. Find out what it takes to stop this. And if what it takes is revering 64 border consolidation operations," Hall said, "returning 11 million people who were relocated or—" She stopped. Let the pause carry the weight of the unfinished sentence. The Emperor looked at her for a long time. "Find them first," he said. "Then we will know what the options are." Hall Voss went back to her directorate and started the largest intelligence mobilization in the Empire's modern history, pulling every asset, every contact, every fragment of information that touched on human activity anywhere in the known galaxy, building a picture from pieces that had been ignored or underestimated or deliberately not followed up for 200 years. What she found, working through 4 days without sleeping more than 2 hours at a stretch, was not reassuring. Humanity was not a minor civilization. Humanity was not a collection of outer territory traders and independent operators who had declined to register with imperial authorities out of preference for unregulated commerce. The picture that assembled itself from the fragments, from the intelligence reports and the contact records and the technical assessments and the navigational anomalies that had been logged and dismissed across 2 centuries, was something else entirely. Something that had been present in this part of the galaxy for considerably longer than 2 centuries. Something that moved in the spaces between the recorded facts of galactic civilization, in the outer territories and the deep corridors, and the unmapped regions that the Empire had never prioritized for survey because they appeared to contain nothing of value. Something that had been watching, specifically and with evident attention, the growth and behavior of the Keth Empire for as long as the Keth Empire had existed. And something that had apparently decided, at a specific moment in response to a specific accumulation of specific events, that watching was no longer the appropriate response. On the 5th day of her investigation, Hall received a report from a monitoring station in the outer territories that 3 more systems had gone dark overnight. Not small systems, not peripheral outposts, core imperial territory, settled worlds with combined populations totaling 2.3 billion people. Gone, same as Varathi, planets intact, people absent, no mechanism visible. Hall took the report to the Emperor before she had finished reading it. The Emperor read it at his desk, standing, because Hall had not given him the option of sitting down before she handed it to him, and he read it with the expression of a man revising his model of the situation he was in with extreme speed. 3 systems, he said. Overnight, Hall said. 2.3 billion people. Combined. He put the report down, picked it up again, put it down. This is not a message. No, sir, Hall said, it is not. This is, he stopped. Yes, Hall said, it is. The word neither of them said was consequences. The word neither of them said was exactly what had been described to a field intelligence officer 230 years ago by someone who had found that officer specifically to make sure the information reached the right level of the imperial hierarchy, and had been right about the information being important, and had been failed by an administration that had received the report and done nothing with it. "Can we fight it?" the Emperor said. Hall had been expecting this question and had prepared her answer carefully. "I don't know what the mechanism is," she said. "I don't know where they're operating from or how they're achieving the effect or what assets they're deploying. I have fragments and inferences and 200 years of deliberately uncollected intelligence, and what I can tell you with confidence is that, whatever they are doing, our current military posture has no documented capacity to counter it, because our military has never encountered it and therefore has never developed a response to it. That's not an answer to whether we can fight it." "The honest answer," Hall said, "is that I don't know. But the question I think you should be asking instead is whether fighting is what this situation requires." The Emperor looked at her. "Explain," he said. 230 years ago," Hall said, "a human representative found one of our field officers specifically to deliver a message. The message was a line, a clear line, stated simply with no ambiguity about the subject matter. 'Leave the border settlements alone.'" She paused. "We didn't leave them alone. We absorbed 64 of them over 30 years. And now 4 systems are dark and 2.7 billion people are gone, and whatever is happening is still happening, because it didn't stop at Varathi and it didn't stop at 3 more systems overnight. You think we can negotiate this?" "I think," Hall said carefully, "that the original communication was not an ultimatum. It was a line. A line is not a negotiation. A line is a description of a condition. We violated the condition. The consequences of violating the condition are now happening." She paused. "What I think we might be able to do is demonstrate that we understand the condition and are prepared to address it, not negotiate the line. The line was already stated. Acknowledge it. Act on it. By revering 64 consolidation operations." "By starting there," Hall said, "yes." The Emperor was quiet for a very long time. Outside his strategy chamber windows, the capital city moved through its ordinary rhythms. A billion people who did not yet know that 4 star systems were dark, and that the arithmetic of their civilization's choices was in the process of presenting its invoice. "How do I contact them?" he said finally. "If I wanted to, how do I reach them?" Hall had been thinking about this since the beginning. "I don't think you contact them," she said. "I think you act, visibly and verifiably. Reverse the consolidation operations, all of them. Account publicly for what happened in each one. Begin the process of returning what was taken and accounting for what cannot be returned." She paused. "I think the contact comes after the action. I think they have been watching this empire for a long time, and they will observe the action and they will determine whether it is genuine, and then there will be contact. And if the systems continue going dark while we act, then we act faster," Hall said. "And we make the action visible. And we trust that a species willing to send one person to warn us 230 years ago is a species capable of recognizing the difference between a government that didn't receive the message and a government that received it and is responding to it." She believed this. She believed it because the alternative was that nothing they did would matter, and she had spent 19 years in the Security Directorate on the principle that defeatism was a luxury she could not afford. She also believed it because of something in Vostan's 200-year-old report that she had read 3 times and that had stayed with her since. The representative had said the line had always been the same line. Always. Not since the consolidation operations began. Not since the empire expanded into the outer territories. Always. Which meant the line predated the empire. Which meant whatever was on the other side of it had been drawing it for longer than the Keth Empire had existed. Which meant they were not reacting to the empire. They were patient. They had always been patient. They had watched and drawn the line and waited and sent one person to say the line out loud one time when it became relevant, and then waited again. And then, when the line had been crossed 65 times and the patience had found its limit, had begun to act. Patient things that found their limit were the most dangerous things in the universe, because everything they did once they began acting had the weight of everything they had endured before. Hall Voss went back to her directorate and began drafting the policy reversal framework that the Emperor had, in the following 30 minutes, formally authorized. She worked fast because the 5th day had become the 6th day, and she had no way of knowing whether the morning would bring another report from another monitoring station. It did. 2 more systems. Hall read the report and kept working. The reversals began publishing within 48 hours. Not quietly, not through internal administrative channels. Publicly, on every broadcast frequency the Empire used for official communication, in every language spoken within its borders. A formal acknowledgement that the border consolidation operations had been conducted in violation of the rights of the absorbed populations. A formal commitment to reversal, system by system, starting immediately. A formal accounting process for the 11 million people who had been relocated, absorbed, or not mentioned in post-consolidation census reports. The Emperor delivered the statement himself. Hall had written it with the specific awareness that it would be observed by something that had been watching the Empire for a very long time and would know the difference between a statement made for political management and a statement made because the situation required honesty. She had written it to be honest. On the 7th day after Varathi went dark, no new systems disappeared. On the 8th day, nothing. On the 9th day, nothing. Hall Voss sat in her directorate and did not allow herself to feel relieved, because relief was premature and the work was not finished, and she had been in crisis management long enough to know that the absence of new catastrophe was not the same as resolution. On the 10th day, a message arrived on a frequency that was not in the Empire's communication registry. In Keth Standard, text only, no source identification, no coordinates, nothing that would allow a trace or a response through any channel Hall's technical staff tried. The message was short. It said, "We have seen the statement. We are watching the actions. The systems that were emptied will be returned when we assess the reversals as genuine and complete. This assessment will take time. The time required is not negotiable. Continue the work." Nothing else. Hall read it 4 times. Then she printed it, walked to the Emperor's strategy chamber, and put it on his desk. He read it. "Returned," he said. "They said the systems will be returned." "Yes," Hall said. "The people." "Yes," Hall said. The Emperor sat with that for a moment. 2.7 billion people, removed from their systems by a mechanism nobody understood, apparently held somewhere that was not the vacuum of space and not death, held pending an assessment that would take time that was not negotiable. "How long?" the Emperor said. "As long as it takes for the reversals to be genuine and complete," Hall said. "That is entirely within our control." The Emperor looked at the message. "Then we work faster," he said. He was right. They worked faster. The reversal framework expanded, accelerated, drew in every administrative resource the Empire could direct toward it. Hall oversaw it personally, because the assessment was being conducted by something that had been watching the Empire for longer than she had been alive, and she was not going to allow the process to be anything other than exactly what the message had asked it to be. Genuine and complete. 6 months later, on a morning that began like every other morning since the statement had gone out, the Varathi system came back. Not the way it had gone dark, not instantly, not all at once. Gradually. Communication frequencies returning one by one, navigation beacons reactivating in sequence, the ordinary noise of a populated system reassembling itself over the course of several hours, until the monitoring station that had logged the original silence logged the return and flagged it as extraordinary and routed it to Hall's desk at a priority classification that had never been used before. She read the flag and went to the monitoring display and stood there, watching the Varathi system come back to life on the frequency readout. 400 million people returning to a system that was exactly as they had left it, their infrastructure intact, their world undamaged, their lives apparently paused rather than ended. The investigation vessel that had first found the empty system was dispatched again. Its report came back in 3 days. The commander, the same Brexan who had written the first report, wrote this one with a different quality. Not the careful, clinical language of a man professionally obligated to describe things accurately. Something that was still accurate but that carried, between the precise sentences, the unmistakable weight of a person who had seen something that had changed what they thought was possible. He wrote 400 million people returned. No casualties. No apparent harm. Populations report no subjective experience of time having passed. Infrastructure intact. All systems functioning. I have no framework in my training or my experience for what I am observing, and I am not going to pretend that I do. What I can report is that this is exactly what the message said would happen when the assessment was satisfied. I recommend that the relevant authorities note carefully what it means that the assessment was satisfied. What it meant was that the reversals had been assessed as genuine and complete. What it meant, in the specific way that Hall Voss understood it after 6 months of working toward this outcome, was that the line was real and the consequences were real, and the offer of return was real, and all of it, every element of it, had been exactly as described 230 years ago by one person to one field officer in the outer territories. Leave the border settlements alone. The remaining systems came back over the following 3 weeks in sequence, as the reversal assessments completed system by system. Each return confirmed by monitoring stations, verified by investigation vessels, reported in precise detail by officers who had no framework for what they were observing and who were honest about not having one. The Empire's 11 million relocated people were a longer and harder problem. They had been scattered through administrative processes that had not been designed to be reversed, and that required the specific kind of institutional honesty that was the hardest kind to maintain when the people responsible for the original decisions were still present in the administrative structure. This work was slow. Hall had expected it to be slow and had built that expectation into her framework. The message had said the assessment would take time. The time was not negotiable. She worked. The Empire worked. And in the outer territories, in the border regions, in the spaces between the recorded facts of galactic civilization, something that had been watching for a very long time continued to watch, patient in the way that things were patient when they had always been patient, drawing the same line it had always drawn. Not the line between strong and weak, not the line between capable and incapable. The line between what was acceptable and what was not. The line that had been there before the Keth Empire existed would be there after it was gone, and that any civilization in this galaxy could find if they looked at the history carefully enough, drawn clearly across every era, in the behavior of a species that did not issue public ultimatums and did not negotiate the line, and did not ever, under any circumstances, accept that it was ignorance of the line rather than disregard for it that explained 65 crossings. The line that said, these people matter. All of them. Every single one. And that said, underneath that, in the way that things were said without words, in the way that a star said it was a star by burning, we have always been here, and we have always been watching, and the silence you interpreted as weakness was never weakness. It was patience. And patience, when it ended, ended completely.